G'day everyone, I'm Benjamin Law. Welcome to the Gallery of Modern Art for tonight's talk, The Problem with Fairy Tales, as part of Goma's extraordinary blockbuster Fairy Tales exhibition. Thanks for coming out on a school night. We are talking stories tonight, and of course First Nations people on this continent have been sharing stories for tens of thousands of years, and together those First Nations constitute the oldest continuing civilization the planet's ever known. So we are really grateful to elders past and present that we can continue sharing stories and knowledge here on what is and what will always be Aboriginal land, and we extend that gratitude and respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight. Now, most Australians would be familiar with at least a few dreaming stories, but a lot of us are probably pretty familiar with fairy tales too. A lot of the time, let's go through the tropes. There's a beautiful, conventionally beautiful woman abused or pursued by a monster of some sort, a witch, a wolf, evil stepmothers, and they're rescued by a prince. Rescued by a prince. Notice I use the passive voice there. And then the evil is vanquished and the beautiful woman and the prince live happily ever after, even though they've literally just met each other and they are completely immune from interest rate rises, cost of living pressures, the need for relationship counselling to work through the legacy of marrying someone they barely know, okay? So these are the kinds of stories that live in our marrow for better or for worse. And I do include worse there because fairy tales can be a little bit problematic sometimes. They can vilify or infantilise women, they can glorify men, they can erase Indigenous people, they can patronise disabled people, and are usually quite cisgender and quite heteronormative, which after Mardi Gras is not a vibe. So what are the detrimental aspects of stereotypical fairy tale character types, and can these tropes be reimagined as a disruptive force to challenge age-old notions? Very big questions for a weeknight, but luckily we have a very excellent brains trust here with us tonight to discuss if there's a problem with fairy tales, what does it say about us, and how should we think about them? Our special guests tonight, two of them on stage with me. Our first is an academic, writer, psychologist and multidisciplinary artist whose work across performance, video, VR, photography and sculpture explores critical disability aesthetics. Please welcome Dr. Deborah Keenahan, everyone.
Thank you.
Next to Deborah, we've got an award-winning writer whose work across poetry, non-fiction criticism and playwriting. Look, it's very likely you've seen her work in The Guardian, SBS Voices, The Saturday Paper, Overland, Meanjin, The Big Issue, Australian Poetry Journal and more. I'm just basically listing every publication that's out there. Please welcome Raeley Lancaster, everyone. And we do have an apology tonight as well, because we were also really looking forward to having comedian, actress, musician, social media star and my friend, Jordan Raskopoulos, but she's unfortunately not doing so good health-wise this week, and we really hope that she gets better soon. If you are here for Jordan, we're locking the doors now, so there's no escape. No, thanks for staying with us. We are talking about fairy tales tonight, and I imagine a lot of you here in this room have already seen the Fairy Tales exhibition here at Goma, and it's quite extraordinary and intoxicating. I mean, you've already seen it, Raeley, Deborah, you and I just did a blitz of it just then, so we've come out a little bit like overwhelmed by the sensory experience. And I was kind of surprised by how emotional it was, actually, because as much as I think of fairy tales, they're associated with childhood, my childhood's over there. But then I started seeing, like, you know, Where the Wild Things Are and Labyrinth and all of those kind of things that really inform our childhood and the way that we see the world. And I'd love to know from each of you, what were the fairy tales that you had growing up and what delighted and intoxicated you? Deborah?
Oh, well, I have to start off saying I love fairy tales. I grew up with fairy tales. I actually collect fairy tales. I have a very specific collection. They've got to be hardbacked and they've got to have beautiful coloured prints in them, and we have like almost a wall in our lounge just full of them. Just love it. But I love the old traditional fairy tales, and my father constantly read to me, and they get into your marrow, and so much so. Can I tell my little story?
Please do. We're here for stories.
Yeah. This is when I was like 5, just starting school in kindy, and the teacher got each one up and asked everybody what they wanted to be when they grew up. Right. So she got me up. I said, my favourite fairy tale, The Little Mermaid. Yes. So she said, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I want to be a mermaid. So I wanted to be a mermaid. Fine, great. Okay, explained what a mermaid was. Now go back to your seats, and we had to get out our books, and we used, I'm showing my age now, then we used black crayons, right, to draw with. And she said, now draw what you want to be when you grow up. Right. I could draw a mermaid, not a worry. But back then, right, we're talking about back then, I'm a boomer. We talked about this, I'm a boomer. Right. So this is before Disney's production of The Little Mermaid. Right. I knew mermaids had breasts, boobies.
What?
But I knew if I drew them, I was going to get into trouble. So I can that is such a formative memory of my childhood, of sitting there knowing I should be true to the story. I should be true to the story, but I knew if I was going to be true to the story, I was going to be in trouble.
What happened next? Don't keep us hanging, Deborah. Did you draw the boobs, and then did you get punished for drawing boobs?
I drew them, but then I tried to draw shells and then hair falling over it.
Oh.
But I
Very
felt
arty.
I had to be true. I had to be true to the
Very tasteful in your early pornographic kind of career.
Yeah. Off to a great
Art
start,
career.
wasn't it?
Hey, look, when you were talking about collecting fairy tales, I mean, you've given us a glimpse into your childhood and your obsession over mermaids. And by the way, like just as a bit of a footnote, like this is before Disney's Little Mermaid. So this is the Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid, right?
Yes.
The original.
Yes, the original.
Which is actually quite gory and bleak, right?
Essentially, fairy tales are, because there was a way of educating children and giving them a warning about life, and don't do this and don't do that, and if you do this, this is what will happen to you, and so on.
Because in my memory, is it right that the original Little Mermaid, she doesn't have the happy ending? She's like kind of punished for transgressing.
That's right. She dies.
Didn't live happily ever after in that one.
Yeah.
No. But
she turns into foam.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's also a type of Mardi Gras party, but that is a happily ever after kind of situation. But you talk about your childhood, but you also talk about how in adulthood you collect fairy tales. And what's your theory? Like, what keeps connecting you to this world of myth and folklore? What appeals to you as an adult about it?
For me, a lot of it, interestingly, is the artistry. Let's talk about the exhibition. It's stunning. It is visually beautiful, and it's immersive, which I particularly appreciate in art. And you go in and it touches every sense in many ways, although you don't get to lick anything, so you don't get to taste.
I mean,
not yet.
Like, they don't say not to.
True.
They say don't touch.
So what you're
with
saying, Rayleigh, is that you did.
I will neither confirm nor deny.
But if there is a tongue mark over at Goma, you can call security now. Rayleigh, I'd love to hear. Oh, sorry. Was there more to add about like you love the craft of it, the illustration,
yes.
the object?
But I also love the storytelling As you can see, I'm a bit of a storyteller. But I love engaging people in the way the stories engage and also teach. Yeah, but that's the problem with them.
Ooh, that's called foreshadowing, everyone. Ray Lee, I'd love to hear from you in terms of like what were the stories that you grew up with, and specifically fairy tales. What were your relationship with them?
Yeah, so I was born after Disney's The Little Mermaid.
But before the live action remake.
But before the live action, which is also great. I love the Black representation in media. It's brilliant. But I feel like with fairy tales and particularly The Little Mermaid, I was really drawn towards the villainous characters. And so I had a huge crush on Ursula the Sea Witch when I was a child.
Can we talk about Ursula for a bit?
Just so voluptuous and just gorgeous.
And also a queer icon, right? Because
Absolutely.
she's based on Divine, the famous drag queen who was very much immortalised in John Waters' films. And then I'm like, do you only connect the dots later on? It's just like, I'm drawn to this queer icon.
Well, see, the fact is that, like, I didn't realise that I was queer until I was about 20, because I thought everyone was just attracted to women. I thought that was... Everyone thought women were the most stunning creatures in the world. But then my mum... was just like, no, you had crushes on Ursula, on
So it's specifically women with tentacles.
on Mulan and Shang combined. Like, she's just like, you were bisexual when you saw Mulan. Like, that's the film.
Can we talk about this queer to queer? But so my thing is, like, there is this massively both heteronormative streak within the kind of Americanized Disney retelling of tales, because let's also shine a spotlight on the fact that they aren't the original stories. They're an American interpretation of the stories. So a lot of them are very heteronormative. Woman gets rescued, blah, 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 blah. But then later you do have these kind of interesting transgressive queer codes, like Mulan has to pretend that she is a boy and Shang's kind of like attracted to that and doesn't know what to make of it. And
Also, sorry, bi icon right there.
okay,
Like,
tell us more.
Like, just like the fact that he was attracted to Ping and then was just like, wait, you're a girl? Ugh. And then had to like come to terms with that. Like, yeah, just beautiful
And
characters.
here's my other theory, like every Disney villain, gay.
100%. Scar, gay. Jafar, yeah.
Yeah, like even if they're not sexually gay, they're gay.
Yeah.
Yeah, culturally gay. Is that a vibe that you think about and look back on as just like, yes, confirmed?
Yeah. But I also think too that it comes back to just the othering of my minorities, where I, as like as a queer Aboriginal person, sort of felt on the outs of a lot of society, of my school peers, and so then these characters that were othered, like I felt so drawn to them because I felt like that there was this shared experience
Now,
there.
isn't that interesting? Because in some ways, my experience is the opposite.
Oh, tell us how.
Because, hey, my physical form, you don't see any women in the fairy tales. You see men. And people with dwarfism, they're either presented as asexual, certainly in the fairy tales. I mean, come on, you've got Snow White living with 7 men. I mean, is that or is that not the ultimate in polyamory or what? But she actually, they're presented very asexually, and that is always the case, and they're always othered. And even with, although you would say there were some females in The Wizard of Oz with Dorothy, but they were still othered very much, and yeah.
And by definition of othered, not at the centre of their stories either.
That's exactly right. And they become the source of, in the publication they talk about Snow White and the 7 heroes. I always refer to them as Snow White and the 7 infamous. And it's that thing of they're always on the side and they're the sidekicks, but they're subjects to laugh at.
I'd love to talk more about, let's lean into the problems with fairy tales, because we're already starting to, and I feel like even in the basic terms of gender relations, feminist standards, women at the centre of their own stories, I mean, to what extent are fairy tales feminist sometimes or anti-feminist other times? I think of Sleeping Beauty, right? You know the story of Sleeping Beauty. It's a story where a non-consensual kiss with a woman literally without agency or consciousness is seen as a win. Cinderella is a celebration of conventional beauty where ugliness is reflected in character. And then here's something I dug up that I thought was really interesting. In 2003, researchers at Purdue University examined the 168 Grimm brothers tales and found 94% of the tales acknowledged physical appearance, and the average references per story were 13.6. They also found that in one story, female beauty was referenced 114 times, whereas male beauty never exceeded 35 per story. I mean, these are stories that we kind of love, but simultaneously
Yes.
a kind of ick.
They're giving all these negative. So if you're old, you're haggard, and the evil stepmother, and so on and so forth, and all too often disability and difference is aligned. The ugliness is aligned with bad character, evil, etc., etc. With the one exception, of course, you have Beauty and the Beast, and the theme behind that being you need to look inside the person. But even then, the remake and that the notion is it's a tragedy that somebody who was attractive becomes this othered. But isn't that a tragedy? And
And it's kind of confusing as well, because at least the Disney version of The Beast was kind of hot.
yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, we talked about this.
At length. Yeah, I hear all of that. I feel all of that. I mean, how do we square that circle? I mean, with those exceptions to the dominant mode. Because as someone who, still collects it, is there something you think about when you're purchasing these beautiful objects and it's like, oh, look, it's absolutely filled with misogyny, but it's pretty.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Oh, but aren't we all full of
contradictions?
Yes, aren't we all full of them? But it's also the language that I enjoy in the fairy tales as well. But I mean, the thing is, fairy tales have an extremely long history, as we're aware, starting off orally and then moving into print, I think around the 1700s, something like that. And the thing is, we then had moving pictures and imagery, we have the capacity to change the narrative. It's as simple as that. I mean, Peter Dinklage said when I was doing a remake of Snow White, and he goes, "Really? Really. We're still doing that. Can't we do a little different? You know, something.
Rayleigh, I'd love to talk about fairy tales and race specifically because, you know, when it comes to, say, the canon of Disney, and it's not the only canon of fairy tales, but it's the access point through which a lot of us come to fairy tales in the first instance. We didn't have a black princess until The Princess and the Frog, and I think that was one of the last traditional animations that Walt Disney had. And then you've also got like a Disney princess, in quote marks, in Pocahontas, but she's actually a real life historical figure who's been Disneyfied, and the real life story of Pocahontas is actually quite tragic, violent and complex. So when you were watching stuff like that growing up, what were you seeing and how do you see it back now?
To be honest, Pocahontas has always been my favourite Disney princess, purely because she was Indigenous and we didn't have that.
Yeah.
Growing up. She was it. And so, like, I loved that film, and I think, like, my dad and my mum got a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when I would just be like, put on Pocahontas, please. But I think that, like, that growing up, you can still love those things, but also see the flaws in them. And I think that that's something that I've been grappling with, particularly as a storyteller myself, and like, and yeah, like I could, like I also manage Indigenous collections material in a library as well, and so really just like I'm responsible for how these materials are described, and so just really grappling with that dichotomy and just I feel like I've gone off on a tangent.
No, I hear all of that stuff. I mean, with the case of Pocahontas, for instance, you know, Disney's currently in a phase of taking the original animations that they had and turning them to live action feature films, right? And I feel like all of them have had to be updated to an extent for modern audiences and how we now understand stuff. But I get the sense that with Pocahontas, that would be a very different story if you were going to make a live action version of that story now, right?
Yeah, I feel like Disney would never, purely because like the true story about Pocahontas is that she was kidnapped, taken from her people, sexually assaulted. She then contracted syphilis and and also was just in incredible pain, had to have a child from that sexual assault. And so her story is so tragic, it is a horror. It can't be anything but. And I don't think that Disney has the guts to approach a live action of that.
Yeah. And then as an adult, you know, do you have a different relationship to the original animation that you love? I mean, like, let's face it, Colours of the Wind, like that still slaps. But
my karaoke song still to this day.
Is it really? But I mean, as we grow up and we approach it with adult eyes and knowledge that we then gain, there is do you feel that fundamental discomfort going back to the stuff that you loved?
Oh, 100%. And I think that that's just being an adult as well. I think just like we've all like done things or like been fans of things. Like I was a twihard as a teenager.
Can you explain what a twihard is?
Please.
A twihard's a Twilight fan, but not just like a regular Twilight fan, like a hardcore Twilight fan.
You were actually drinking blood. Is that right?
Again, I will neither confirm nor deny. But we've all got those things from childhood that we really want to keep close because they are a source of comfort in a way. But I think that you can still see them as that comfort, but also see them for what they are, which is problematic.
I actually agree, because for me, part of the thing of the love of fairy tales is that it takes me back to being a child, sitting on my dad's lap, being read to. And I loved that. I love, and so it has a nurturing memory for me. You don't want to lose that. You don't want to lose that. But then, but this is what we do as humans. There are things that we love, we value, but we can look at them and we can critique them and go, well, we can change it.
And this is something that you do in your work, Deborah, because I particularly would love to hear about Othering. Now, this is a theatre show that you made. It was a one-person show that you performed, 6 performances for Sydney Festival, only at the start of last year. And it's a one-woman show that interweaves your own story with the broader history of short-stature people and people who have dwarfism. Now, I'd really love to know, we've got actually some images from this. So let's see if we can see some. So, yeah, tell us what we're seeing here and tell us about the origins of this show.
Well, the origins of the show is about, and it's called Othering, and it is about how people who look different, particularly with dwarfism, are treated as other than or less than human, dehumanised, which is what my first PhD was about in the psychology. And the image that you're seeing here is one part of the show, where it's talking about the history of how people with my condition were, shall we say, we were used as entertainment by royalty. And this was particularly from, these are actually images from Velasquez's works of court dwarfs in the Spanish court. And the image of me there is starting to move into the freak show era, right, which is when people like myself would be put on display and people would come in for the purpose of staring, laughing, whatever, and very much objectified. And in many ways, fairy tales do that. But the othering was part of how that history forms something of a discourse around how we treat people who are different. And this can be some of the problems with fairy tales, is that they can contribute to that discourse. And, the other image that you see is the ultimate, again, relating to the freak shows.
So what era are we talking about here where this was common? And what you're talking about is travelling circuses and things like that?
Circuses, freak shows, they were still going on in the 20th century. And interestingly, here's a little bit of history. Part of the reason that people went into the freak shows is that, and this occurred in England, in particular, they introduced what was referred to as the ugly laws, where people with deformities, etc., would be fined if they were seen on the street
Wow.
to be a visual offence to people.
Wow.
And so to sort of have a living or whatever, they would sometimes go into the freak shows to survive.
Wow, so it was simultaneously a form of obvious dehumanisation, but it was also often the only source of economic flexibility that they had.
But the interesting thing is, when was the last time that the ugly laws were implemented? 1972.
Wow. So it's within living history
Yeah.
that law was in
Yeah.
place.
Yes.
Wow. I think we've got
Yes.
another image from your show as well.
Yes. And this is me stood in front of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it came also on the back of the Disability Royal Commission, which I was one of the witnesses at. And it pertains to the rights of being treated with respect. And so when you have a discourse around difference that says that we can laugh at, we can do this, we can do that, they're less than us, well then, it's a battle to have to get the respect.
Yeah. I mean, what you're doing here is really tapping into both personal and broader history about story and myth and representation as well. I'm curious, when it comes to fairy tales in general and representations of people with dwarfism, people who are short-statured, and more broadly, disability, like the recurring thing keeps coming up that if you are disabled or deformed, as some would put it, it automatically corners you into
Yes.
either being a villain
Yes.
or a novelty.
Yes.
And
And
so,
as I said, well, Peter Dinklage is very quite overt in he's looking forward to the day when he gets the part where he gets the girl.
and we were reviewing this
Yeah.
before because Peter Dinklage has been in so many roles, but his most famous role is as Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones. And we were kind of recapping back, and he does have a lot of sexual agency, but he doesn't get the girl. In fact, he loses her
Yes.
in the most horrific way.
Yes, yes. And he is humiliated in the process.
Now, you mentioned Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, first Disney feature animation, that was feature length. And now they are doing what Disney does, which is they're remaking it into a live action feature. But there has been a lot of controversy and conversation around what that should look like in the modern age. And I'm not even sure where they've landed right now.
I don't know either.
There were shots from set that actually showed people with dwarfism, actors with dwarfism, acting on the show, and a lot of people were like, oh, wait, is this still the story? And then there was an update where they were like, oh, they're all animated now, it's fine. And people were like, well, this looks really strange. What's your take? I mean, do we need that story now? And if we were to have it, what could it look like?
Okay, if we did have it, first of all, does it have to, the title, let's address the title, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I mean, they're that immediately. I mean, by the same token, I actually don't have a problem with the word dwarf. I don't have an issue with that term. However, in the way that it is presented, it is still, an other than. And similarly, they are presented as unreal people. I mean, they were not even presented as people, as characters. So if it was to be redone today, do they necessarily have to have dwarfism? Can there be a multiplicity of disabilities, of differences? Why can't I play Snow White? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I could carry that off, I reckon. No, but yeah, the hero and the heroine, they're never the ones who are different, except said, unless we talk about Beauty and the Beast.
What I like about how you've reframed my question is that instead of being prescriptive, like here's a checklist of how to do things correctly and properly, here are some questions that we should be asking of ourselves and each other as storytellers, which I think is really useful. I mean, Ray-Lee, you are a storyteller as well in many, many different modes. What are the questions you ask yourself and what are the questions you'd like other writers asking when it comes to their stories and how they represent queerness, Aboriginality, being a woman, representation in general?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I feel that like people are quite scared to approach characters that are different to themselves, and I think that anyone can write a story, and you can have all different types of characters. You just need to be mindful of just like how you are portraying them. Are you punching down? Are you dehumanizing? Are you othering? Are you segregating? Because I read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of fantasy authors still put racism in their stories, but it's like, why can't you just have a story about a bunch of different races and just not have hierarchy, particularly coming from a Indigenous perspective? I don't believe in hierarchy. I feel like we are all not the same. We are all different, and that's beautiful because that's what brings us together. And I think too that like you said earlier, like about just like just storytelling, it can bring people together in such a beautiful way. And so I think that like we need more diversity in stories. If you're scared about putting in a character that's different to yourself, go to that community, seek advice, consultation, pay people for their labour, but like seek that assistance.
Well, there is a little bit, something of a saying of you can't be what you don't see. I have never seen, and I don't mean me as in Deborah Keenan, but I've never seen anyone like me portrayed as a heroine or and certainly not in fairy tales.
But then again, you were on stage in front of a lot of people at Sydney Festival, which are quite significant audiences. Were there some interesting conversations in the foyer between people and with you afterwards about seeing you on stage?
The reason I laughed then was I just thought of some comments my brothers made. But
okay.
Yeah.
Brothers will be brothers.
Yes, that's right. Well, the answer to that is Yes, there were. And the number of people who said, I really didn't realise it was that bad. And you go, well, raising awareness, and this is partly why I actually I changed careers somewhat and moved into the arts, because I found it so connected people and it touched so many people. And I think that's the power of art, the power of what we see with the exhibition, is that it can raise awareness. So let's do that. Let's show how we can do things differently. Let's have different representation. Let's do it. That's a creative challenge for people, isn't it?
I mean, that comment that you just had, when people see your show and you're talking about the history of representation of people with dwarfism, I didn't know it was so bad. I mean, one of the reasons I wish Jordan Raskopoulos was here, for so many other reasons, was, I remember as a cisgender person watching the Netflix documentary Disclosure, which is about the history of representation of trans people throughout popular culture. And I feel like even if it's not explicit, there are some fairy tales that tap into those anxieties of transformation. Transformation can be a beautiful thing in fairy tales, but transformation can be seen as transgressing as well. And again, when I watched that documentary, I was like, I didn't know things were that bad myself. So we've all got these blind spots that I think are worth talking about, which makes me think, Rayleigh, I mean, speaking of blind spots, we've been talking a lot about The Little Mermaid tonight. And you did mention before that you loved the recent remake of The Little Mermaid, which I saw starring Halle Bailey and Melissa McCarthy. And oh my God, Halle has like a set of pipes on her. If you haven't seen her renditions of those classic songs, it's like, wow, that's a banger. But of course, there was quite a lot of anxiety around the casting of a young black woman in the role of a mermaid, to the point where people would make videos showing documented evidence that if mermaids existed in this part of the world, they would not develop enough melanin to actually be black. And therefore, Halle Bailey is entirely inappropriately cast for this film. And it's like, we are talking about people with a fishtail. Like, calm down. When you're watching all of that unfold, what was your take?
All of a sudden, authentic casting matters.
Hire the person
all
with
of
the
a
tail.
sudden.
But also, I'm sorry, I've got like on my diving certificate, so I can dive.
Oh, yeah.
Can't drive, but I can dive.
You need that on a T-shirt.
But it is so cold down there. Why is Ariel so skinny? That's what I want to know. Like, give me fat mermaids. Yeah. That's what I want.
Give us Orca Ariel.
Yes.
Yeah. When you were watching all of that race discourse unfold around Halle, because around that time I interviewed her because she and Melissa were doing the rounds, and she was very, diplomatic about it. But we came to the conclusion that all these people are massive racists, obviously. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they do feel so hugely protective over this story. And I'm like, you're grown adults.
Yes.
Chill. What did you make of that, especially as an Aboriginal woman who was delighted by the casting of a black woman in that role?
Yeah. So obviously I can't talk about the Black American experience because I don't know that. Also, as you can tell, light-skinned, I have a lot of privilege there. And so, yeah, that is I think that, what am I trying to say? Just like, I kind of, I don't have social media, so I was thankful not to get a lot of those comments coming across my my feed or whatever, and so like I sort of entered that film knowing a little bit about the discourse, but I honestly didn't engage in that discourse because it happens all the time. It happened when they announced Lilo and Stitch, and that live action, and the fact that Nani, I believe she was played by a light-skinned Hawaiian woman, and then also recently with Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Percy Jackson, which are two series that I hold very close. Love them, and I actually enjoy the live action remakes because they bring a new perspective to the story. They put people in the narrative that were excluded, and like I know we don't talk about the Avatar, The Last Airbender film that doesn't exist. But maybe if it did exist and they perchance cast entirely white people, except for Dev Patel, who is a dreamboat.
Sorry, I just had to grunt. Yeah.
And so seeing actual Indigenous people play Katara, there is speculation that the boy that plays Sokka might not be Indigenous, but the girl that plays Katara, just seeing a Indigenous woman embody that, that is really special, and comes back to what you said about if you can't see it, you can't be it. Yeah.
Can I ask Riley a question? Really, because please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not Indigenous, but with the oral and the Dreamtime stories, would that be considered if they were represented visually, you know, in the form of, yes, shall we say, not by Disney, perhaps, because I'd be a little concerned of how would that sit?
That is a great question, particularly because I just published a paper about dreaming stories being classified within libraries as folklore and fairy tales. And so my perspective is that dreaming stories don't belong in the fairy tale or folklore category. They aren't fairy tales, they aren't mythology. I'm sitting right here, I'm not a mythical being. And so to me, dreaming stories, they are about ancestors, they are about the history of this place. They are my philosophy for how I go about the world. Some blackfellas perceive dreaming stories in religious context, and so to some they are our religion, and so yeah, I think that they don't belong in that category. Also, folklore, fairy tale, mythology, they are Western concepts that were put on us. And so they've got a place and they are valid, just not here and not in this land. And so I guess,
I think that's
that's my perspective.
So there's
That's
different contexts there.
Yeah.
I mean, it also, even as you were saying that as well, I was reminded by, I've had conversations with First Nations academics and writers who also talk about, dreaming stories as being beyond just story. They're there to serve solid purposes like legislation, like first legislation. And there's a really great documentary out there called The First Inventors. That was an NITV Channel 10 co-pro. And in that, like what I didn't know, very naively, is Aboriginal dreaming stories also are about historical record of geography, which is wild, and the way that they can map to the years geographical formations.
What in many ways you're saying that vastly distinguishes them, significantly distinguishes them
From
from
fairy
fairy
tales.
tales. And so therefore, I would say we really need to take a much more critical eye on fairy tales, really.
I do want to invite the audience into the conversation really soon, but one of the key phrases that you brought up, Rayleigh, as you were talking is new perspectives. And I think like we've already been veering into this territory already, but I'd really love to hear where we're moving to when it comes to discussions and interpretations and retellings of fairy tales. Which are the modern day fairy tales that excite you, that you'd love to recommend? I mean, I'll start off. Pan's Labyrinth, which I think is part of the Goma kind of like cinema series, which is all free, by the way, and runs alongside the exhibition. So come around and check out that program. I don't know if it's like fairy tale as such, but Pan's Labyrinth is amazing. I don't know if it's fairy tale as such, but like Pixar's Coco, like I think is just like a beautiful, beautiful story. And also, I think Frozen 2 is Frozen, but like also Frozen is like this great kind of like feminist tale for a lot of people, but also Frozen 2 is like this really interesting interrogation of colonialism and a history of genocide in a Disney film. And that was something I was not expecting. And I think it's interesting to have that in the canon. What about the two of you? What are the modern day fairy tales that excite you?
So I think just like retelling a story isn't enough. That can be a bit boring. I want to see stories that will subvert canon, speak to the past, but in a way that embodies present and future too, and so bringing it to poetry, because I feel like poetry is such a important part of our literature, particularly Black literature in this country, and Evelyn Aralewin's collection Drop Bear is one of my favourite poetry collections ever. She takes classic Australian fairy tales, folklore, such as Fern Gully and all of those sort of like kitschy what's that koala?
Blinky Bill.
Blinky Bill,
Bill.
that's it. And she takes those stories, and Evelyn's, she is a Bundjalung woman, and so she takes her cultural perspective and then subverts those stories. She's got a beautiful poem. Beautiful. It is very like powerful, and anti-colonial. It's called Fern Up Your Own Gully. Definitely recommend. But she's also got a poem in that collection, Drop Bear, that subverts on the picnic at Hanging Rock story and puts Aboriginal people into that narrative. And so poetry, I feel, that's where Black storytelling is just incredibly strong and innovative and really impactful. So that would be
Well, I think, well, just you tagged me in because I'm sitting here thinking, and I thought, I can't think of a modern day fairy tale that I go, yay. But you said Black storytelling. Let's get some different voices that will tell different stories.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's getting those different voices.
Thanks so much, you two.